Hello and welcome back to PDM Vlogs. Today we are looking at the 24mm Vivitar F2.8 Pentax mount lens. That is a mouthful, so I'm just going to call it a 24mm lens. I am using it to film on right now. If you couldn't tell, I think it's in focus. I hope it is. Focus peaking does work on my GH5, so I believe it is. If it's out, I'm very sorry. I normally use this Lumix lens. I do the touch to focus and that normally gives me perfect focus, but in this instance obviously completely manual, and I just want to show what it looks like sort of in a regular filming environment such as this one. So if any of you have been watching the channel for a little while, you know I'm a big fan of vintage lenses, of manual lenses, of old style, fairly inexpensive lenses, anything unusual and a bit different from the norm. Obviously, as I mentioned, I use my 12-60 a lot, and that's my workhorse for most things. That is a native lens, of course. But all the Panasonic and Olympus and any kind of native lenses do tend to be quite a bit more expensive. And when you go on eBay, you can find these old style SLR lenses that are completely manual for next to nothing. I'm filming on my GH5, of course that's micro four thirds. I'm using a Pixco 0.7 times focal reducer, which only cost me about 65 quid, and it's doing the job great. So that is giving me more of a super 35mm sensor. So that is giving me, on my 24mm, it's giving me the equivalent of about maybe 33 to 34mm equivalent on a full frame, which is pretty decent. It's sort of fairly wide, but not too wide. You could probably use this on a gimbal, although you would have to keep the same distance because without an electric wireless follow focus, it will be very difficult to rack focus and use the Steadicam gimbal. So I'm finding I'm tending to use manual vintage lenses more. I'm wanting to use them more just because of the visual quality and the look that they give. So for most things, you know, for corporate based stuff or, you know, live events like music and stuff, I will always stick to a good old native lens because I can generally rely on the autofocus and I don't have to worry about much setup, and obviously it has built-in IS, so I don't have to input any kind of focal length so the sensor knows how to move. I'm finding I want to use vintage lenses more for things like weddings, especially the portraits, and anything kind of more stylistic. So, you know, music videos and narrative films when I eventually come to doing them, and anything kind of artistic, stylistic, that sort of thing. I just think the vintage lenses just give it a much nicer look. Obviously, they're normally fairly inexpensive. Complete manual controls, so things like, you know, the focus ring is properly manual, none of this focus by wire nonsense. And then they normally have some resistance too, which is quite nice. And then obviously manual control aperture as well. And then just because they're old and they're kind of analog built, if that makes sense, you know, they're normally sort of assembled more by people than robots. They kind of have their own individual characteristics that's maybe a bit asymmetrical, just kind of an analog feel almost, and I actually really like that look. I really like the feel of it, and obviously because they're cheaper, and most of these prime lenses go to f2.8, f1.8, 1.7, something like that, you can get really good low light. You can get what, you know, much shallower depth of field, especially with a speed booster or focal reducer, whatever you want to call it. I don't know if speed booster is actually copyrighted, so I'll just call it a focal reducer. You can do a lot with them, and you know the main thing is that in sort of cinema production they still use manual lenses. They don't use autofocus as far as I'm aware, and maybe except for like some sort of specialist shots. It's normally manual focus, and these bear a lot more resemblance to cine style lenses than these sort of modern, you know, hybrid lenses, I guess you could call them. So that's kind of an attractive sort of quality to someone like myself who wants to not only do, you know, just general video for clients and stuff. I want to do more kind of creative and filmic style video. Before buying this 24mm lens, I had this Vivitar 28mm, and there's a surprising amount of difference between the two lenses. For one thing, this is almost entirely plastic construction, apart from things like the mount. And the field of view is surprisingly different, as you can see between these comparative shots. Mostly, I'm noticing that just by the fact that this 24mm that I'm filming with now is completely metal design, it feels a lot heftier, it feels a lot more premium, and this being completely plastic, it does feel almost like a toy. This is probably the cheapest feeling lens that I own. I mean, the actual footage I get off it, I'm pretty happy with. It's got quite a nice effect, although the edges do blur quite considerably wide open. Also worth noting, I have declicked this one, but it's a little bit loose. And I don't want to kind of go opening up this one as well because I don't want to risk breaking that one because I got a really good deal on it, and it was a bit more expensive than this, which I think was about 25 quid. This was like 45, which might not sound like a lot, but when you're a poor filmmaker who doesn't earn much money, 45 quid is still, you know, a lot to be losing out on. So yes, I'd rather not try and break that one as well. The sides on this 28mm are far more blurred than this 24. Now, it's not perfect, it's a vintage lens. The older lenses do still tend to have blurring at either side, but it's nowhere near as prominent as on the 28, and it's something that I could actually use in most circumstances. You can see in some of these test shots that, you know, especially close up, it looks nice and sharp. It's got a really nice sort of smooth bokeh, as people like to call it. I just call it like depth of field background, but bokeh I know is the official term for it. So it's nice and sharp close up. When you get to distance, it's a little bit softer, but it still works. It does focus to infinity, but not by the markings on the lens. A lot of the time when you're adapting lenses, you will find that they don't quite line up, and you can maybe use, you know, some of these more expensive speed booster focal reducers, you can adjust the glass in it to kind of correct for that. So it actually does it right, but generally speaking, the focus peaking, which I'm using now, the focus peaking on the GH5, which works perfectly with all these vintage lenses, does the job. So I don't worry too much about looking at the markings, as long as I know which way is which, and I can have a look and kind of get a rough feel for how close I need to be. It works, and I just normally do a pinch to zoom to make sure I'm filming to distance, and make sure I've actually got it in focus. It does kind of, at the sides, it kind of creates, I think it's sort of chromatic aberration. It's kind of just got that vintage look, which I quite like. But generally speaking, I'd probably use it more for sort of foreground stuff rather than back. I probably wouldn't use it for landscape stuff unless it was for some particularly stylized thing. I'd probably stick to one of my native lenses. But for anything portrait, anything kind of narrative based, anything, yeah, as I said, creative, stylistic, this is the sort of lens I can imagine myself using. And of course, pairing this with my GH5, the sensor stabilization is just incredible. So I can handhold this all day and it looks decent. Obviously, this is a problem with the GH5, not with the 24mm. If you are walking quite a lot, you'll sometimes get the kind of, it kind of sort of jumps about a little bit if you're not careful. So you can do kind of walking with it. Walking works better with a dual AS lens. But if you're sort of panning around and sort of moving around a little bit, that normally works pretty well. But if you're doing sort of full-on strides and not doing the ninja walk, then you will find it kind of moves up and down a little bit. You kind of have to kind of work with it. So that about wraps it up, really. I mean, I'm just, you know, there's not much more to say about it, really. You know, if you've used vintage lenses before, I'd highly recommend using this one. You know, I think you could probably get away with using this on pretty much any camera. Obviously, if you're using a full frame camera, you'll get more blur on the sides, but if you're using an APS-C, Super 35, or of course Micro Four Thirds, definitely recommend it. I definitely recommend paying a bit more for it. You know, this 28mm is fine, but it's a lot more. I mean, when I put it on the adapter, I find that the focusing becomes tighter. I'm not sure why. It's always been like that even before I declicked it. Don't have any issues on this one, and this does feel almost like a mini cine lens, which, you know, for a for a filmmaker is a good thing. So yeah, that's the 24mm. If any of you had it, tell me what you think, and I'm sure you'll see it used more in some future videos. Until then, stay subscribed for more, check out all our webpage and stuff, and we'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.